It's good to be back in front of the microphone recording podcast number 17 in my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this particular podcast, we're going to take a look at how colonial governors operated, what their powers were, what they were expected to do, and the influence that they had upon the forming of the American Constitution and our state governments. Generally, the men who were appointed to govern colonies expected that they would be personally enriched by being a governor. A few of them were talented administrators, and a few of them were overtly corrupt and inept. Most of them could probably be described as mediocre, because the process that appointed them did not regard aptitude or ability as an important qualification to being a governor. The most difficult task that a colonial governor faced was dealing with the colonial assembly in their colony. On the one hand, colonial governors were expected to uphold the interests of the mother country, while the assemblies, which were elected by the colonists, were much more focused on their colony's specific interests and needs. With such a system of opposite interests in play, it was inevitable that conflicts between governors and assemblies would be both frequent and bitter, and they very much were. While on paper, the colonial governor was the most powerful person in each colony, by the time of the American Revolution, the colonial assemblies had more control over colonial affairs than the governors did. Before going any further, it might be a good idea to make some general observations about English colonial government in North America. There were three types of colonies in North America. First, there were the corporate colonies. These were originally organized as business entities under the authority of the Crown. In these colonies, the governor was chosen generally by the freemen of the corporate colony. Second were proprietary colonies. These were colonies that the king granted to his family and friends to run as their own little kingdoms. Most of the colonies started this way. In these colonies, the proprietors chose the governors. And the third type of colonies were royal colonies. These were colonies administered directly by the crown. In these colonies, the king chose the governor. By the time of the American Revolution, most of the colonies were royal colonies. Whether a colony was corporate, proprietary, or royal, they all had a government structure that was in general outlines identical. Each was a mirror image of England. The federal government and the government of the states today closely resemble the government structure of the colonies. Regardless of the type of colony, all colonies functioned as an extension of crown authority or the crown power, which was nebulously called the prerogative. The colonies were said to exist as a matter of royal grace and favor. This meant that the king could do whatever he wanted with the colonies. He could make them or unmake them as he saw fit. None of the colonies were established by Parliament. The process of selecting a governor was all a matter of political connections. There was no effort to determine whether or not a man was an able administrator or if he would be a good governor. At that time, offices in government were often looked upon more as a property interest, and they were often bought and sold. Sometimes this happened with colonial offices as well. Once a man was selected as a governor, he had to go to London, kneel before the king, and kiss the king's hand. A commission was then drawn up, naming the man as the governor of the colony. The language used to address the man in his commission depended on his social rank. For example, if he was a commoner or a knight, he was addressed as, "To our trusty and well-beloved." If he was higher on the social scale, say he was an earl, it would read, "To our right trusty and right well-beloved cousin." And if he was as high up as a duke, which was at about the top of the social scale, it read, "To our right trusty and right entirely well-beloved cousin." So depending on his social rank, the king would address him with more formality. The governor then took an oath of office before the king's council, which was called the Privy Council, and then all his baggage, which was probably considerable, was loaded aboard a ship, and it included any gifts that the king wanted to give to any Indians in that colony. When the new governor arrived at the colony, his ship was given a 17-gun salute from any fort that he passed. Upon landing at the dock, there was usually an escort or a parade to greet him and to escort him to the State House. This included some local militia troops in uniform and maybe some VIP escorts from the colony. This was a big occasion. People looked out their windows, they hung out flags and other things to kind of decorate the way. Once they reached the State House, the governor again took the oath of office, and his commission was read aloud in front of the entire legislature. The governor's first official act, which imitated the king, was to announce the continuance in office of all the officers currently in the colony, so the treasurer, the speaker, all the other officers. The governor was entitled to be addressed as Your Excellency, and being the governor bestowed great prestige upon him and his family members. The governor's powers were extensive. He had power to appoint officers and judges with the advice and consent of his council. He controlled the colony's official seal, and he could charge fees for its use. Back then, like today, certain documents had to be sealed to be official, and kind of like a modern notary, the governor could charge fees for its use. The governor could grant pardons for crimes, except for murder and treason. He could appoint markets and fairs. He could grant land. He had an absolute veto over legislation, and he had power to dissolve the legislature, which the governors used frequently whenever they had quarrels with a legislature that wouldn't do their program. The governor also had judicial powers. He presided at his council, which sat as a supreme court, in effect making him the chief justice. The governor also had military powers. He was regarded as the captain general and commander-in-chief of a colony's forces. This essentially made him the commander-in-chief of all the militia in a colony, as well as any naval vessels that a colony might have for its defense. The governor could also grant commissions to privateers. This meant that he could commission private vessels to go out and engage in piracy against enemy nations. Anyone familiar with our Constitution today will recognize many of these powers that still exist either in Congress or in the President. On paper, the governor's powers were quite considerable, but in reality they weren't exercised so easily. For one thing, the governor served during the king's pleasure. That meant that the king could remove a governor at any time for any reason. And if there were interests in a colony or even in England powerful enough to undermine a governor, it could happen. Also, if the king died, the governor's commission automatically expired in 6 months. This in effect made the governor a lame duck. The biggest problem the governors faced was that he served two masters. He served the king, but he also had to make sure he got along with the legislature and the colonists. And the interests of these two groups were often very different. The governor had considerable duties. He was responsible for everything from keeping forts repaired to defending the colonies to enforcing laws and even converting the Indians to Christianity. All of these activities required money, which he could only get from the legislature. Colonial assemblies learned early that during times of urgency or war, they could withhold funding and extract favors and concessions from governors. In the end, this is what made the colonial assemblies more powerful than the governors. We're going to talk about that more in my next podcast, which will be about colonial legislatures. When a governor was appointed, he not only received a commission from the king, he was also given a set of instructions that he was expected to obey, and failure to do so could result in reprimands and even possible removal of office by the king. He was not allowed to show anyone the instructions. The big problem with these instructions was that it created an inflexibility. To enforce them to the letter would have greatly irritated the colonists, and often the governor had to compromise with the colonial assemblies to get things done. But even compromises that were painfully hammered out could be vetoed by the king, which undermined the governor's authority and his ability to get things done in the colony. Sometimes instructions from the king forced the governors to throw themselves under the bus and take responsibility for things the king wanted done. For example, in 1729, the king ordered Governor Burnet of Massachusetts to dispose the assembly to pay a due obedience to his majesty's commands, but whatever you do of that kind is to come as from yourself in your private capacity, and not to let it look like any new overture to them on the part of the crown. So governors were really put into the classic middle management dilemma, wherein they were expected to enforce policies dictated by above to people below them who did not appreciate or would not even comply with those instructions. Another problem governors faced was that they didn't have enough patronage to build up a loyal political following. In England, the king could give away pensions and jobs, titles, and other things, and in this way, the king was able to control and manipulate Parliament. The governors could give away land and some offices to their friends and political cronies, but it wasn't on the same scale, and it made it very difficult for a governor in a colony to build up a political following that they could count on. In many instances, governors gave loyal followers and friends multiple offices, so there was multiple office holding back then, which today would never happen. It would be considered totally corrupt. By modern standards, colonial government would have been very corrupt. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the purpose and reason that men sought to be governors of colonies was to enrich themselves. The colonies existed to enrich England and its chosen few. Some governors actively sought promotion, or we could call it a promotion, from smaller colonies to larger colonies. So, for example, if you were the governor of a small colony like Georgia and you wanted to make more money, you had a much better chance of doing so governing a large colony like Virginia or Massachusetts. There were also no term limits on the governor's term of office, although the average governor lasted only about 5 years in a colony, but as long as they had the king's pleasure, they could serve as long as they wanted. Governor Benning Wentworth of New Hampshire governed New Hampshire for over 25 consecutive years. You'll notice that in all of this discussion about the governor's powers and authority, there's no discussion about public service. There was no hint that that was even the reason why they sought the governorship. It was all about personal enrichment. Many governors did nothing to help this image of corruption and self-servingness by engaging in petty conflicts with the assembly and with other groups in the colonies. One of the notorious governors was Governor Cranfield of Massachusetts. In order to do a payback on assemblymen who obstructed his programs, he appointed members of the assembly as constables, which was a hated office at the time. The penalty for failure to accept the office was that these assemblymen had to pay a fee or fine, which irritated them and the public, but it was a petty little quarrel. Another colonial governor, this time Governor Cosby of New York, he kept the same assembly in session during the entire course of his term of office. He never held elections because the assembly was pretty much going his way and he didn't want to risk losing their support. This greatly irritated the colonists who felt that regular elections were the key to liberty and to an Englishman's rights. One of the most notoriously corrupt governors was Lord Cornbury, who governed both New York and New Jersey at the same time. Not only was he avaricious and corrupt, but he didn't do anything to help his image by wearing women's clothing, which was technically at that time against the law. One assemblyman even referred to him as a detestable maggot. Fortunately for the colonies of New York and New Jersey, Cornbury was recalled. It was a huge systemic problem that there was no way to remove corrupt governors. As long as they had the king's pleasure, they could serve in office. The only two colonies where the colonists actually had a say in selecting the governor were Connecticut and Rhode Island. But other than these two colonies, there was no impeachment process, and in order to get the governor removed, you had to have the king or his ministers do it. This often forced the colonists into resorting to rioting and mob activity. Right up at the time of the American Revolution, especially in Boston, mobs terrorized the royal governors who frequently had to flee Boston for their safety. In 1749, the Assembly of Colonial New York made this observation about governors in general, and it probably reflected the sentiment throughout the colonies. They seldom regard the welfare of the people otherwise than as they can make it subservient to their own particular interest, and as they know the time and the continuance in their governments to be uncertain, all methods are used and all engines set to work to raise estates to themselves, and therefore, should the public moneys be left to their disposition, what can be expected but the grossest misapplication? I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, or at least found it useful. For further reading on this topic, I recommend these books and articles. Royal Instructions to British Colonial Governors, 1670 to 1776, collated and edited by Leonard Woods Labaree. The Quest for Power, The Lower Houses of Assembly in the Southern Royal Colonies, 1689 to 1776, by Jack P. Green. Controversies between royal governors and their assemblies in the Northern American Colonies, by John Francis Burns. The Local Executive in the British Empire, 1763 to 1828, by W. L. Morton, published in the English Historical Review, Volume 78, Number 308, July 1963. Royal Government in America, A Study of the British Colonial System Before 1783, by Leonard Woods Labaree. American Colonial Government, 1696 to 1765, A Study of the British Board of Trade and its Relation to the American Colonies, by Oliver Morton Dickerson. The Structure of Politics at the Accession of George III, by Louis Namier. The Corporation as a Form of Colonial Government in 3 Parts, by Herbert L. Osgood, published in Political Science Quarterly, Volume 11, Number 2, June 1896, Volume 3, Number 3, September 1896, and Volume 11, Number 4, December 1896. The Proprietary Province as a Form of Colonial Government, also in 3 parts, by Herbert L. Osgood, published in the American Historical Review, Volume 2, Number 4, July 1897, Volume 3, Number 1, October 1897, and Volume 3, Number 2, January 1898. The Crown and the Colonial Charters, 1675 to 1688, published in 2 parts, by Philip S. Haffenden, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 15, Number 3, July 1958, and Volume 15, Number 4, October 1958. The Mace and the Gavel, Symbols of Government in America, by Silvio A. Bedini, published in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, Volume 87, Number 4, 1997. The Separation of Powers in the 18th Century, by William Seal Carpenter, published in the American Political Science Review, Volume 22, Number 1, February 1928. The Concept of Democracy in Colonial Political Thought, by Roy N. Loken, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 16, Number 4, October 1959. The Aristocracy in Colonial America, by Arthur M. Schlesinger, published in the Proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society, 3rd Series, Volume 74, 1962. British Politics Preceding the American Revolution, by John W. Wilkes, published in the Huntington Library Quarterly, Volume 20, Number 4, August 1957. Peripheries and Center, Constitutional Development in the Extended Polities of the British Empire and the United States, 1607 to 1788, by Jack P. Green,